Hey, what's up, guys? In this video, we are going to be going over Reverb in Ableton Live 10. Reverb is a very usable effect. It will create depth in the sounds that you are feeding into it. And Reverb it's a spatial effect. And what Reverb is it takes a signal and puts it in a space. And it does this with this plugin here called Reverb, but I'm going to actually just leave ourselves with an audio track, get rid of the sends, and I'm going to drop in the reverb right here, right? This is the reverb right there, and I'm going to turn it off for a second, toggle it off, and let's go into packs, into core library, samples, congas, and we're going to get something dry. Okay, this is a really good example, right? It's a very short sound. So how reverb works, you have to understand the concept of how this is done, and I'll make a comparison to computer graphics for video games. It's very unrealistic to take a scene with a light source and map every single photon and every interaction with every material within that space to create shadows and global illumination and all that fun stuff. These things are done with approximations. So if you look at Skyrim, for example, if you look at the shadows, those are done with approximation, right? Shadows are a really strong hit on computer game frame rate because it takes a little while to calculate those things, and to make it more high quality you need to be taking more samples, and ray tracing is a different thing. But even ray tracing is essentially a approximation of how that light will behave given the light source, what it's bouncing off of and reacting with, because a single photon will bounce off. Well, it starts in the center of the sun, essentially, and takes a while to get out of there, and then it travels through space and, hits the atmosphere and bends a little bit, and then, bounces off a leaf, and then bounces off a tree, and then hits your eye, and then excites a thing. Like just an unimaginable amount of interactions are taking place when we decide to go outside, which, it's kind of rare. Anyway, that's a joke. In computer graphics, it's all approximations, and in the audio realm, it's a similar deal. For reverb, you wouldn't want to have a sound source and then a listening source and then a space and have all of the sound wave propagation modeling bouncing off surfaces, bouncing off other surfaces, converging, diverging, reflection, like just all these crazy things that are happening within this space, every single molecule vibrating. You do it with approximations, right? And what a reverb essentially is just a bunch of delays, right? Because, the speed of sound operates at a speed, we can use delays to a bunch of delays that are modulating, and there's some other things going on in there which I'll get into. You put all these things together and you get a really good approximation of what a reverb and what a space sounds like, right? There is something called impulse response, or IR reverb, where they actually fire off an impulse and then record the response of the space, right, with everyone being very quiet, and then they can apply that to a reverb plugin, but that's essentially transferring that information into a bunch of delays, as far as I know, and you're essentially doing the same thing. It's super complicated, but let's just kind of break it down a tiny bit more. So I'm going to show you how, I guess, sound propagates. Let's get a room here, right? Let's actually make it not a square room. And what I want to do is, let's say we have a, yeah, let's just say, sound source, right? Oops. Let's just say, yeah, we'll call it a source, right? And it is a circle, right? Because these sort of things propagate in waves, and they kind of propagate outwards like that. But for the sake of this demonstration, let's just pretend that sound will travel in a straight line, because I can't do these circles all the time. Kind of intense. So that's the sound source. That is someone standing in a room with a conga and they strike it, right? So right down here will be the listener. Yeah, we'll say listen, right? And that is the main area where the listener will be, right? And this will change depending on where you sit in the room. We have the sound source, and the first thing we hear, right, is essentially boom, boom, right? You excite the membrane on that conga, and then the sound essentially, yeah, travels there, and that is the direct sound. What happens elsewhere within the same time period is the source will jump over here to this wall, right? From the straight line, or not straight line. These are, we're going to get into standing waves in a little bit, but yeah, sound doesn't actually work this way, but let's pretend it does. Another sound bounces here and then bounces to the listening position, right? And what that is doing is that will somewhat create a delay in that signal, right? So boom, right? Speed of sound, boom, boom. And then this one has to go over here and then over here. And then there's essentially a delay in that signal. And there's a bunch that travel around, right? They just zigzag everywhere. And, one will bounce here, one will bounce here. So imagine all of these delay. You have one that goes over here, and then over here, right? And all of these waves, right? These waves will kind of hop into each other, and they will interfere with each other. And you'll get this interference pattern, and they'll start to interfere with each other, and then that will be kind of a swarm kind of effect. So that's essentially how reverb occurs. Is just what you're hearing in terms of that reverb sound is a bunch of reflections happening from the source that bounce around, and then you hear it in the listening position. So the initial impulse you will hear kind of right away, and I'll just draw this from the side view, right? So this will be the listening position, and we'll just draw a microphone, right? And this is a microphone on a stand, and then this will be a snare, right? And then you take a stick, and then that stick will hit that snare. Things will propagate outwards, right? And then you'll hear it, but they'll also go and then bounce off the ground and then come up and things. And these are called early reflections, right? These happen first, right? And they're very much immediate, and they happen around the same time as the direct sound, right? And then that's one of the first things we're going to be focusing on is the early reflections. So these reverbs are made up of two components. They're entirely kind of separate things. So yeah, snare hits, what you're hearing is the direct snare, but then hearing the bounce off the floor as well, and then maybe the bounce off the ceiling and stuff like that. And it all kind of comes together in like a brief little, filtery wave forwarding mess that, is, if you don't have it and you don't hear it, you'd be like, whoa, that reverb just sounds completely different. It's because it's very important. And then from the snare outwards, bouncing around these later reflections, we hear those soon after. And I think it'd be worth it just to demonstrate what's going on here. So I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to actually delete the first reverb in here. So this one right here is the impulse, right? When we're dealing with reverb, we're dealing with an impulse, like the potential and the change of energy from a dormant state to an excited state and then back down. That's an impulse. And impulses are very useful in DSP. Let's go to the reverb and just go 100% wet, right? So if we have this one 100% wet, and then this first track here doesn't have anything on it, it's essentially a 50-50 wet-dry signal. So let's give that a play, right? And I'll turn this reverb track off. We have a dry track here, right? Reverb on, and I'll just disable or mute the dry track, right? And that is essentially stripping out the initial sound, and we're hearing the delay. So that should be very well understood currently. I'm going to duplicate this again because we want to have control over. I want to show you kind of what the reflection and the diffusion sounds like separated on this device, and I'll get into this a little bit later. There is controls over the reflection and the diffusion network kind of amplitude, because these are two separate things used in the creation of the reverb, digital reverb effect. Let's actually have this first one reflect, so we'll just get rid of the diffusion, and then this one we will just have diffusion. And I think it will be worth me freezing these. And these are different names, but the diffusion is the later reflections. It's just called diffusion because of the diffusion network. It's going to become more clear as this video goes on. So I'll freeze these both, and I will flatten these both. And what this does is we'll essentially render it in place with all of the effects, right? So we can see this now. So this one right here is the dry conga. I'll just leave that named the way it is. This right here will be the early reflections. And then this one will be the late reflections, right? And we can see that they sound a little bit different. Let us listen to just the early reflections, right? Early reflections happen first. That's what it sounds like, right? When you strip out the initial dry signal and the late reflection swarm that fills up the space, we just get the early reflections. This is sound source direct to your listening position or ear, and also mixed with a little bit of the floor and maybe the side walls, but those immediately bounce to your ears or listening position, right? And those are the early reflections. This right here happens, the late reflection happens a little bit afterwards. This happens as things start to accumulate in the room, as the room air starts to become kind of excited, and you just get a bunch of delays in the sound. And what does that sound like? It sounds like, right? It rings out a little bit. And all three of them together, right, sounds like that. If I take out the early reflections, right, there's a little bit of a delay there, and it doesn't sound, well, I mean, you can use it, but it doesn't sound natural and realistic. And then we can have it just with the impulse and the early reflections, right? And you get a completely different room. And we'll get into, how you would achieve that. That sounds like a treated room, where the room will absorb all of the late, or as much as the late reflections as you can. That's what a dead room sounds like. Pretty interesting, eh? Anyway, it's interesting to me. So let's us kind of recap things here. And what I'll do is I'll just move this guy over here. Okay, so we have a line, and that line is represented by time. So, time in these things, it always goes left to right, right? So first off, let's say we have a line here. No, I'll just yeah. I'll just draw a straight line as best as I can. This is the impulse, right? Impulse or sound. And then over here, we would have the, from this range to this range, we would have the early reflections right in here, and I'll write that down, right? Early, I'll just call those first. First reflection, and that is, the sound of just the initial, like, first kind of bounce off of all that fun stuff. And then from here to here, we have, what is called the late reflection. Oops. Reflection. Late reflection, and this would be the swarm or the body. So, impulse would be a sound, and then it would dictate, first reflection, right? And then after that, you would have the swarm there. And what dictates between the impulse and the first reflection occurring would be the pre-delay. So there'd be a delay between the impulse and the first reflection. So when you're kind of approximating and making up a room in a virtual space that you want some of your tracks to sit in, you want to take that into account, right? And that would be, the delay between that. So hope that makes sense. Let's actually just get into it. So let's drop in another reverb again, and this is what the reverb will look like when you first bring it in. I'm going to go into preferences and zoom the display so we can hear a little bit. So we have this ability to have a frequency processing before we actually affect the reverb, or before it's processed. So this is essentially just two filters beforehand, right? And this will prevent some higher frequencies from coming in this part right here. And what this does is it essentially prevents higher frequencies from accumulating in there, and it's another way to kind of shape things, right? I can turn off low, right? So we can adjust the overall vibe of the reverb just by doing some input processing, and this is before the delay transfer function chain, right? And we can shave the highs off, right? We can go all the way wet, so we're just hearing the reverb sound, reverb wet signal, right? Right. The filtering is very important, and it'll make your sound when people say, dark or bright, this will dictate, dark or bright. So this would be a dark reverb, right? Gives you a darker vibe, frees up the high frequencies as well. And then, this would be a brighter vibe, right? We'll leave that off for now. The pre-delay, and notice the default wet-dry percentage. This is important as well. This is more than a wet-dry percent. It kind of dictates the distance you are away from the kind of listening position and the sound source position, right? Because as you increase the wet signal, the dry signal will become kind of buried, right? Right, and it dictates how close, let's say, a microphone or an ear is to that excited sound source. And that's why when you mic up like a snare, you have the mic right on the snare, because that SPL is pretty intense. Like if you put an ear up to a snare and have someone smack it with a drum, you will get ear damage because it's very high SPL. And when you do that, the dry snare will become, it'll take up the dynamic range of the whole thing, the whole body of the sound, right? You'd have to bring the volume down on the microphone. It won't be able to pick up a lot of the reverb sounds as well. So just keep that in mind. This delves into a lot of the recording theory. But anyway, so that's what wet-dry. Wet-dry is very important, and that's because when you double-click, it'll go to 55%. So that's an important control. Let's move on to pre-delay. Pre-delay dictates the delay it'll take for the impulse to be fed into the, I guess you'd call it the reverb processing area, right? And I'll just maybe name it as such. I'll call it verb processing, right? And then this right here would be, a pre. So a lot of these devices, they have built-in input processing built kind of within them, because it's so commonly used. They don't want you to have to drag in some sort of filter or something before and then create a chain and stuff like that. It's already built in just because it's so useful, right? So verb processing, and this would be the pre-processing, but you get the idea. So pre-delay will kind of delay the signal before it gets into the reverb processing here, and we can increase it, right? And it's very apparent if you have it like extreme, right? So you mix and match these controls to shape the reverb there. And you can make some very unnatural and abstract reverbs, because if you have a pre-delay this long and the ring out is so short, or the decay time, it doesn't really make sense, but it can be used as a creative effect as well. Right, you'd want that to have a longer decay time, which we'll get into. I'll just move it here so you get the idea. Right, even then it's pretty long. So you can get some outer spacey kind of things with the pre-delay. Let's move on to another thing here. This is the early reflections shaper, and this is the early reflections control. So what we can do is we can actually make it 100% wet and then get rid of the diffusion network output. And let's just listen to the early reflections. Right, we can do some things here, and these the pre-delay, shape, and spin, they essentially modulate the delay lines of that kind of early reflection, and it's a number of different things put together. It kind of sounds like a comb filter when you play around with it, but this is a modulator, and then you have an intense. This is an amount of modulation, and this is the rate of modulation. And we might get into this in a later video, but modeling spaces and understanding it is another topic. But we can shape the early reflections with the shape and the spin modulating it, because the early reflections can have their own kind of body and shape to them, separate to the diffusion network, right? It all kind of comes down to science that I can't accurately explain right now, but right, we can shape things around like that. So this would maximum value of shape. It will sculpt the prominence of the early reflections, and then the spin here, what it essentially does is, it's not actually saying, I think it modulates the early reflections in time. Right, so you can hear that modulation. It's almost like chorusy, but it's kind of interesting, right? I usually have spin off, just because it can accumulate and sound weird. But yeah, shape makes it kind of less dense. This makes it more dense, right? And that's kind of important. So let's move on to the nifty area. There's as you can imagine, this can be a very computationally intensive device. So there's different quality modes. So right now it's eco, and this is based on I guess CPU usage, and this will make the term I want to use is lush. So right now, let's just turn on the diffuse here. It's still 100% wet, so all we're hearing is the wet signal, right? Decent space. As we increase, we can hear just kind of a different shape, right? So the general rule of thumb is if you have a longer decay time or a wider space, you want to have the quality set to high. You want to computate that swarm of reflections. It's very important, or else it'll just kind of sound, not that natural, right? So this is not actually like an option that you can just kind of overlook. It's actually very important. It'll actually change the sound of your reverb. So let's increase the decay time. Right, nice kind of realistic space. We go to eco. Sounds similar, but yeah. Yeah, it sounds a little bit brighter, and there's not much of an interaction between the waves and the room. So yeah, general rule of thumb is the quality and the decay time are essentially, very important, and they act in tandem to create a sound. And yeah, so basically don't overlook that. So yeah, again, shorter decay times, smaller, shorter reverbs use eco, and larger use high. But there's no rules, like just go bananas. What do you want? The size, what it says in the info, it controls the size of the virtual room, right? And yeah, this essentially controls the size of the virtual room, right? So that's a small room, and if you're in a like a hallway, go in there and clap, and you will hear those very high kind of that ringiness to it, like that. That's a standing wave, and you can hear that when you clap in a hallway. And that is the interaction of all these bounces all along the room in the hallway. It's like pretty intense. And that is what that kind of model is. So yeah, it describes it as a metallic feel. You can also do the same thing maybe in like a shower. And yeah, it just creates a lot of interesting things. And as you increase it, right, you can get a varying size of room. Right? So size is very important, contrary to popular belief. Chuckle, chuckle, chuckle. Size will dictate the size of the room. Okay, so let's look at the reverb device. So this is one of those devices that will transfer a mono sound into a stereo sound. I mean, it can. So if you take a mono sound and you, for example, feed it into a delay, right? Oops, not vocoder. You feed it into a delay, and then you take that, feed into a delay, hit play. Right? It's mono. Essentially, this is a stereo track, but let's just ignore that. If we unlink the left and right, right, we now have a stereo. If it can actually transfer mono to stereo, so that concept is pretty important. And how we define stereo is that if there's no difference between the left and the right, it is mono. So this looks like a stereo track, but is it really? We have to go through some metering to see, but it actually looks like it's a mono track, mono clip. It looks mono to me. And there's a couple ways to go about checking that using phase cancellation, but we'll get into that another day. What this does is, again, it will transfer it from a mono to a stereo signal, and there's a stereo control right here. So you have a mono signal being played through a speaker in a room, right? Or a someone like clapping, or something. No, that's a terrible example. You have a speaker, and it'll play one speaker, and it'll play a sound in a room. And as these sounds bounce around the surfaces and they come to our ears and we hear them, we will hear differences between the left and the right, depending on where we are in the room and stuff like that. A lot of things go into that, but it's a transfer from mono to stereo. And how we do this in, say, recording in a room. So say you have a piano, you want to capture the piano and the room, you will use dual mics to capture that natural reverb. And this is essentially what this is. This will take a number, and the number dictates to the angle of those microphones. So there's a number of different ways to have stereo miking, and that's done with angles in degrees. We might get into that a little bit later. You'll hear it as, X, Y, right? But let's just say that, this will be the angle difference of the two microphones in, the position. And this will pick up a completely different sound. If we have this set to 0, it's effectively taking those microphones and then, merging them into one. There's no degree offset or difference between their placement. And that means that it's effectively mono, recording mono. So mono in, mono out. Right, and I'll set that to 55. Right, that's a mono reverb. A mono reverb effect. And as we increase the separation, right, we'll get a different kind of vibe of the stereo. Like it'll capture the left and the right. Right? It's a really useful tool. And by default, it's at 100 degrees, which is kind of fine. So what that means is one mic is pointing in, they're both in the same position in terms of where they are in the field. They're both in the same kind of position here. And what you're doing is you're effectively having one microphone here and then one microphone here. This microphone will pick up the reverb and reflections off this surface. This one will pick up this surface, and you'll get a separation in sound. It should be pretty explanatory. I wish I had my Zoom recorder here. I'd show you. It has two microphones on the top in an XY position, and you can change it to 120 degrees. And yeah, maybe I'll show you what that sounds like later on down the line. So stereo is important. Stereo will give your room a bit of realism, and it will sound like you're actually in it. And this is done with kind of offsetting the modulation between the left and right processing. But yeah, let's move on to a different thing here. Now this is getting into not so much crazy science, but I want to explain. So say if there is like a party going on next door, or you drive past a nightclub, or a car drives past you and it's listening to very loud music. This should be a very common experience. The higher frequencies are kind of absorbed within that space if it's kind of somewhat closed off. And the lower frequencies pass through. That's why when you're experiencing these experiences, it's like a whoomba, 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 whoomba. Like, and then as you get closer, or you go inside the building, you hear the full range of music. And what you're effectively listening to is a low pass filter, right? The higher frequencies are closer together, and they tend to bounce off of surfaces and kind of, or they bounce off the surfaces and they interfere with each other and cancel parts of each other out, or they're completely kind of absorbed by that material, right? For the lower frequencies, because the wavelength is further apart, they actually can travel through things easier. Like lower frequencies travel through solid objects like nothing, right? And that's why, when you hear like a noisy neighbor, you hear muffled people laughing, muffled whatever, people, doing all sorts of fun stuff. And the music that's playing, you're only really hearing the lower end, right? Sound passes through solid objects more efficiently than, lower frequencies pass through solid objects more efficiently than with air. And it'll travel through concrete, man. It's crazy. So that is what's called the diffusion network is doing, right? So let's say you have, I want to just briefly, I'll kind of demonstrate. So by default, it's kind of looks like this, right? It's curved down, right? This graph should look very familiar to you because it is giving us a time domain representation, kind of like an EQ. And what is it? It's two shelves. I have to turn that on. Two shelves here, right? We effectively have two shelves we can use to shape the sound, the diffusion network. So with the higher frequencies rolled off, the higher frequencies will kind of cancel each other out or get absorbed and transferred into heat faster than the lower frequency ones, right? And that sounds like this, right? And if I have a complete uniformity between the low and the high, so no diffusion is taking place, things are bouncing around like crazy, right? Especially if I have a longer decay time. Super long ring out. And if I set, hey, absorb those higher frequencies, like faster, so it doesn't ring out as much. Right, hear that? Pretty neat. And that is adding and approximation to the room. So, extreme example. Imagine you have a room that's, the size of a gymnasium, like in school. And that gymnasium is made out of marble. That sound will not necessarily, like the higher frequencies will not necessarily be absorbed, and that thing will ring out forever, right? Right. It would be hard for the higher frequencies to kind of go in and then penetrate, right? And I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but I think it's very important that I explain this, right? So let's just imagine that, this surface right here is a piece of marble. So I always say oops when I grab my pen. It's neuropathy, guys. My hands aren't working that well. So sound comes in, right? And this is marble. It can't penetrate marble, right? So it bounces off, right? Marble. So let's say we have a gymnasium made out of shag carpets, right? There's just fuzzy stuff everywhere, like super long, naughty jungle of love, like just shag everywhere. Shag everywhere in this room, right? Shag. Yeah, let's call it shag. The sound, let's just assume that it travels in like straight lines. Sound energy comes in here and it can be absorbed by this material. And then you don't get as much reflections coming out, right? But the lower frequencies will pass through. Same with the marble, right? Lower frequencies will pass through. So we can kind of, I guess, illustrate that, higher frequency content, depending on the material, will bounce out. And if the material is more absorbent, like shag, foam, cardboard, packing blankets, packing blankets used by Jay-Z, they work. That will attribute to how the room behaves when you feed sound into it, right? So we got room size, and then we have the ability to kind of shape things. So, there's middle of the road sort of thing. If you're in a library, right? And library has carpet, but there's also bookshelves. Bookshelves have unevenness to their, orientation. So things will be diffused through that, right? But still reflected, right? And we use kind of diffusion to maybe control reflections, but still maintain the liveliness of that room. Diffusion networks are very, very clever, and I enjoy them. And it's a good way to achieve the room that you want. And it's essentially, a filter on the transfer function within the delay network. Right? Right? And with this reverb, depending on what the settings are, you can emulate different kind of gear. So right now, kind of sounds like a plate reverb, which we might get into in a later video. Plate reverb is a reverb with two gigantic metal plates, and actually I'm not going to get into that. This diffusion network just controls the which sounds are absorbed first as the pre-delay swarm kind of rings out in a virtual world. Really hope that makes sense, because it took me a while to understand it back in the day. And what this also will do is it will control the higher frequencies accumulating within your mix. That's always important, because dry effects, you want to have that kind of roll off because you don't want it to accumulate, because you just have a bunch of high end, and then you'll EQ it, you'll lose clarity and energy. So you want to kind of have it set up this way. So that would be the diffusion. Decay time sets the time things kind of ring out. So there's multiple things at play here. There's the size, the decay time, the diffusion, the density to scale. All sorts of things are put together. This will just make the decay tail longer. And you have the ultimate control, and you can really dial it in, or you can make impossible reverb spaces, right? So a small size with a large decay time, which isn't like a decay time of 9 seconds in a bathroom, can exist unless the bathroom is really big, but it can't exist according to the laws of physics, but you can do it. It's really cool. And that's just the, what's it called? Yeah, to adjust the time required for the diffusion network's tail to drop negative 60 dB of its initial amplitude. So yeah, it controls the decay time. That's just a fancy way of wording it. Freeze is really cool. Freeze, flat, and cut are interesting effects. What they do is they kind of keep it's just an infinite decay time, essentially. And the freeze, I'll just show you what that does. There. That decay will kind of go on forever. And it's a really neat effect. The flat and cut will modify the freeze output so that it bypasses the high and low shelf filters, the input processing here, and it will prevent the input signal from adding to the frozen reverberation. So what that does is if I go cut, I can turn the freeze on and it won't kind of accumulate. Right? With it on, it won't accumulate. I can press freeze now and nothing will happen. Freeze is kind of like at this point, whenever I press this button, save that, I guess you call it decay, or I call it a swarm because it's actually a swarm of a bunch of delays put together. Freeze it at that point and then keep it. That's why I had to press play and then press that button at the same time. You can also automate this, but yeah. And then the cut will just kind of let things accumulate within it, which again creates a impossible space where energy, or where I guess entropy of sound doesn't exist. It just keeps on going forever and ever. Amen. It's a really interesting effect there. It's very special. Okay. The chorus we're going to get into the chorus effect a little bit later, but what this will do is this will modulate the left and right in terms of its timing and move them kind of different relative to each other. Choruses are really cool. You hear choruses all the time, and it's done with double track. Listen to, I guess, any Taylor Swift is an example, and I'm going to oversimplify this. Taylor Swift will have, just a single her singing, and then when the chorus happens, you'll hear kind of a thicker sound, and that's done with a different Taylor Swift on the left and the right, and that's called double tracking. And this is done in guitars, double tracking, but on stage or, in the studio, you can have a guitar chorus effect, which essentially converts a mono guitar signal into a signal that has a difference between the left and the right. And this is done, this can be done with tape and stuff like that, where you kind of offset a little bit one track from another, and then you kind of play it and you can modulate it back and forth. This will become clear later. Chorus is a way to essentially thicken up the sound and make it sound more stereo Right here is the modulation rate, 8 hertz and stuff like that, between 0.01 hertz and 8 hertz. And then here is the modulation amount. You can get a really cool effect this way. I'll turn off the diffusion network high. I'll turn up the reflection and diffusion. Right, it'll become clear later on, but it's just a way to kind of beef up the sound. And let us move on to density and scale. A lot of controls kind of work together in order to achieve the reverb effect. Density will set the density of what is called the swarm, and this will kind of add in more delays to the signal. Right, and it might not be the best example. Maybe I'll just make this a little bit louder. Okay. Hope you can hear that. Okay, so the density will allow the decay time to have more, I guess, bounces. Right. And kind of subtle, but as you process the sound and you have kind of more complicated things, and it becomes very obvious. This is essentially the, I guess, the amount of I guess delays within that swarm. It's kind of like increasing the, I want to say the how many ray traces you're taking, kind of I guess similar to that. It's just the density of that. The scale will control the coarseness of the diffusion. Higher values tend to produce a darker sound. So when you have a swarm of sounds bouncing off a wall and coming towards you, that's a lot of waves. So if you take, one drop, if you take a rock and throw it in a pond, right, you get that propagation of waves that comes out. If you have a bunch of people throwing rocks in a pond, right, those waves will propagate out, and then they'll touch other waves and then kind of interfere and then bounce off and create a new wave. And sound acts in a similar way. And if you have enough interference within those waves, it will kind of, again, absorb the higher frequencies first before the lower ones. And that's why in the description here, it says that the higher values will tend to produce a darker sound. Right, and we can do all sorts of cool, fun stuff with that. And it's a mixture of all of these. Oh, and I'll go on high. Right, notice how it just completely changes things depending on the setting, the diffusion, and the density. Really, really cool. There's so much you can do with reverb, and it puts things in a space. And the typical workflow of, say, a reverb like this is, I'll go into a new live set because I'll delete. It's very apparent why there is a reverb send here. Why is that? Why is there a reverb send automatically? Why do people use reverb sends? And it's because you would want multiple tracks being fed into the same reverb so that things have cohesiveness. And you can add something called depth into your mix. I mean, you can have a different reverb for every single track, but with different reverb, different settings, our ears are very spatial because, to avoid predators and whatnot. There might be a discontinuity there. You don't have a whole lot of control. So typically things are done with sends, right? Parts of one track, different parts of the other are all sent to things called sends. It's completely optional. And this will act as a reverb for everything. And then you mix it in with the, the amount here and the amount here. You can do all sorts of fun things with that. And then this is sent to the master. And that has worked for a long time. A good example is if you have a bunch of drums, like you've mic'd or you recorded a drummer, a lot of different audio tracks. You wouldn't have everything going through a different reverb. You would put those all together in a bus and then send that to a reverb. Similar example occurs here. So I hope that this makes sense. If you really want to play around with the reverb, but don't worry if you don't get it right. I still don't really get it. It's kind of an interesting thing, but I don't know. The theory of operation is somewhat I'm able to somewhat understand it. And if you don't, Live has these awesome kind of presets here where you can choose different I guess spaces that they've modeled. And if you really want to get into it, there are these really special emulations of plate reverb, and then there's impulse response if you want to get realistic. But yeah, we got Hall, and you can just just drag it in, right? And then we have what a Hall effect would kind of look like, right? Decay time of 3 seconds, right? Shape, pre-delay, all these things. You can use these as a reference, right? So these are slightly higher values. For a room, we'll do like an ambience medium room. These have different shorter values and different diffusion, right? This would be more reflective, things like that. And you want to think about the material in the room that you're thinking of, right? Is it hardwood? Is it marble? Is it concrete? Is it big? Is it small? Is there shag carpets? All sorts of stuff. And all sorts of stuff, right? So, yeah, you can really learn a lot from just kind of exploring. And, oh yeah, I didn't get into mixing I kind of did. You have the ability to mix and match the reflection amount and the diffusion amount. And diffusion is actually light reflection, just another name, but it's called diffusion network. But anyway, you can mix and match things that way. And when you mix and match things like this, you're effectively changing the listening position where you are in that space in terms of, I guess, like a one-dimensional closer or farther. You can give that illusion. Anyway, I've talked about reverb in Live for the last hour. I hope you learned stuff. I hope you enjoy. Take care and have a good one.